On the morning of October 14th, 1962, a muskrat trapper named Walton Reeves was working the sedge margins of a bog off the Muskegon River in Newaygo County, Michigan. He had run this trap line for 11 years and knew the ground the way a man knows the floor of his own house in the dark. Every hummock and soft spot memorized through boot leather long before his eyes ever confirmed it. The bog sat low that autumn. The water table had dropped almost a foot below its summer high, and where the exposed peat had begun to dry and crack along the edge of his line, something caught the early light and threw it back at him, a dull glint where nothing should have been reflective at all. Reeves knelt down in the cold mud. He worked the blade of his skinning knife under the object and pried it loose from ground that had held it undisturbed for far longer than anyone standing in that bog that morning could have guessed. What came up out of the peat was a wedge of dark, pitted metal, close to 7 inches long, tapering from a broad, slightly curved working edge down to a narrow tang shaped for a wooden haft that had long since rotted to nothing. Reeves turned it over twice in his palm before he understood what he was holding. It was heavier than a stone tool of the same size had any right to be, and it was plainly not stone. He wiped the worst of the mud from it with his thumb, wrapped it in a feed sack, and carried it home, where it sat on the kitchen table for the better part of 3 months before anyone outside his own household ever laid eyes on it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A bog is, among other things, a machine for stopping time. The waterlogged peat that fills a Michigan wetland is starved of oxygen almost from the surface down, acidic enough to slow bacterial decay to a crawl, and cold enough for most of the year to slow it further still. Wood submerged in that environment can survive for centuries with its grain intact. Leather survives, cloth survives, and iron, counterintuitively, survives far better in an oxygen-starved bog than it does buried in ordinary aerated soil, where rust works fast and finishes what it starts within a human lifetime. In a bog, corrosion still happens, but it happens slowly, in a specific and well-understood way, converting the outer surface of the metal into iron sulfide and leaving the interior structure, the very thing a metallurgist needs in order to read a tool's forging history, largely undisturbed beneath a dark, brittle crust. This is why Walton Reeves could pull a tapered wedge of hand-forged iron out of the ground in 1962 and still recognize it as a tool rather than a lump of rust. The bog had not preserved it out of any intention. It had simply done what bogs do, and left the rest to whoever happened to be walking a trapline the morning the peat gave it back. What Reeves had pulled out of that bog was, at first glance, unremarkable. Iron tools surface in Michigan wetlands and riverbanks with some regularity, dropped by trappers, lost by land surveyors, discarded by farmers clearing new ground. The state archaeologist's office fields several dozen such reports in an ordinary year, and the overwhelming majority of them turn out to be exactly what they appear. 19th or 20th century hardware, occasionally an older piece of colonial trade goods, corroded past easy recognition by anyone who is not already looking for it. What made the Reeves object different became clear only under sustained examination, the kind that a farmer's plow-turned scrap rarely receives. The blade carried no rivet holes and no bolt pattern of any kind, nothing to suggest it had ever been fitted with the machine-cut hardware that marks almost everything manufactured after the 1700s. Its edge had been ground and reground across what appeared to be a long working life, each resharpening angle sitting at a slightly different pitch than the one before it. The way a tool looks after it has passed through more than one pair of hands and more than one generation of use. When a metallurgist eventually sectioned a corner of the tang under magnification, the internal grain told a story that no machine-forged trade axe could ever tell. The iron was Bloomery iron, hand-worked from smelted ore reduced at a low and uneven heat, folded and hammered dozens of times over to drive the slag out of the metal, the resulting layers still visible under the microscope, the way growth rings sit visible in a cut length of oak. It was, in the plainest terms available to the science, a hand-forged object shaped by someone who understood fire and iron the way a working smith understands them, not the way a merchant understands a crate of factory-cast trade blanks shipped west by the barrel. The man who performed that sectioning was a metallurgist named Dr. Adrian Voss, on loan from a Michigan State University materials laboratory to assist the State Historical Office with an unrelated survey of colonial-era trade axes recovered across the Lower Peninsula. Voss took the Reeves object almost as an afterthought, a curiosity brought in alongside a stack of genuinely routine trade goods, and by his own later account he expected it to occupy no more than an afternoon of bench time. He photographed the object from every angle the lab's camera allowed. He measured its dimensions to the millimeter. He cut a small sample from the tang for cross-sectioning, a standard procedure, and, on an object of this size, a minimally destructive one. What the cross-section showed him did not match anything in the trade axe catalogue he had spent the preceding 6 weeks compiling. He ran the sample twice more to be certain of what he was seeing. He compared the grain structure against known European Bloomery samples recovered from 16 and 1700s contexts, the era in which French and English iron first entered the Great Lakes trade network in any real volume. His comparison set included the standard French trade axe head, easily identified by its distinctive eared pole and its machine-punched eye, along with the later Hudson's Bay pattern axes that circulated through the region by the 1750s, both catalogued exhaustively and both instantly recognizable to anyone who had spent 6 weeks, as Voss just had, sorting through crates of them. The Reeves object matched neither pattern in outline, in hafting method, or in metallurgy. The slag inclusions did not match. The carbon distribution did not match. The forging rhythm, the specific pattern of folds and hammer marks left behind in the metal, belonged to a tradition Voss could not immediately place against anything in the regional record, and he said so, carefully and in writing, in a 2-page memorandum he attached to the object's growing file. That memorandum is the last document of substance the file contains. What happened to the Reeves object over the following 18 months is, according to the State Historical Office's own paper trail, close to nothing at all. A radiocarbon sample was drawn from a fragment of preserved wood fiber recovered from the peat still clinging to the tool's tang, wood that had clearly been in direct, unbroken contact with the iron for the entire span of its burial, giving the dating team a physical association rather than a mere proximity. That sample went out to an outside laboratory in the spring of 1963. The result came back that July, and it placed the wood, and by direct extension the iron sealed against it, within a calibrated range centered on the 11th century, somewhere between 300 and 400 years before any documented European iron reached this stretch of the continent by any known route of trade, exploration, or missionary contact. The date sat in the file for weeks before anyone in the office acted on it. When a response finally came, it was not a call for further investigation. It was a single line, initialed but never signed in full, recommending that the sample be retested at a second outside laboratory before any conclusion was drawn from it. No retest was ever logged in the file. The correspondence register for the State Historical Office, covering the last week of July and the first 4 days of August of 1963, the exact window in which that recommendation would have been acted upon or quietly set aside, is missing 3 consecutive entries. The register resumes on August 5th with an entirely unrelated matter, in a different clerk's handwriting, as though the intervening days had simply been lifted whole out of the record and never replaced. Adrian Voss did not remain in Great Lakes archaeometallurgy. Within a year of filing his memorandum on the Reeves object, he shifted his research entirely toward industrial corrosion testing for the automotive sector, a discipline that shared almost nothing with the bench work he had been doing when the tool first crossed his table. He published no further papers on pre-contact ironworking. He gave no further interviews concerning the Reeves find, and when a regional newspaper reporter tracked him down in 1971 for a follow-up piece, Voss declined to discuss the object at all, on the record or off it. He would spend the remaining 3 decades of his professional life studying rust patterns on car frames, a perfectly respectable and entirely unremarkable specialty, and one that had nothing whatsoever to do with the question his own memorandum had raised and then left, unresolved, sitting in a state office file drawer. The Reeves family kept the tool. Walton Reeves, and after his death in 1981, his son Harlan declined every offer to donate or sell it into a state collection, a decision that in later decades would come to look less like stubbornness and more like foresight, given how little institutional appetite ever existed to actually study the object once it had been formally handed over. It sits today, catalogued only in a private family inventory, inside a climate-controlled case in a house outside Fremont, Michigan, available to any researcher who calls ahead and asks, examined in full by exactly 2 academic visitors across the 60-plus years since Adrian Voss first cut into its tang. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Reeves Bog is not the only place where this pattern surfaces. In 1978, peat cutters working a marsh near Horicon in Dodge County, Wisconsin, recovered a second-hand forged iron implement, this one a narrow chisel-like blade rather than a wedge, drawn from a peat stratum that a University of Wisconsin graduate student dated, using the same direct wood association method to arrange overlapping the Reeves find by roughly a century on either side. The Wisconsin object was examined once, briefly, by a visiting specialist named Dr. Perry Aldrich, who noted the same absence of rivet holes, the same irregular resharpening pattern building up along the edge, and the same Bloomery forging signature under magnification, layer folded upon layer, exactly as Voss had described in Michigan 16 years earlier, though neither man appears to have known of the other's findings at the time. Aldrich, in a detail that will by now feel familiar, moved on to unrelated postdoctoral work within the year and never returned to the object in a single published line. A third case surfaced in 1991 near Mille Lacs Lake in central Minnesota, this time a slender tanged point rather than a blade, recovered during agricultural drainage work on a wetland that had been dry only a matter of weeks. Its surviving wood context yielded a date range once again centered on the 11th century, a full continent's width away from Voss's Michigan bog, and yet sitting, almost to the decade, inside the same narrow window. 3 separate bogs, 3 separate states, 3 separate decades of recovery. And in every case, the same sequence repeats itself with an almost mechanical consistency. A hand-forged iron object, a radiocarbon date that predates any known European iron in the region by several centuries, an initial researcher whose findings are careful, specific, and entirely defensible on the page, and then silence, a quiet professional pivot, a file that goes cold, rather than a file that ever closes with an answer written into it. None of this requires believing that Norse ironworkers walked the banks of the Muskegon River, or that some undocumented smelting tradition flourished among the peoples of the western Great Lakes centuries before any written account describes one. The position the evidence itself supports, without embellishment in either direction, is narrower than that, and in some ways more uncomfortable than the more dramatic alternative. Something was being forged from iron, by hand, using Bloomery methods, in this region, at a date the accepted historical model has no established place for. The wood association in all 3 cases is direct and physical, not inferential, not a matter of nearby soil layers that might simply have shifted over time. The metallurgy itself is not seriously in dispute. 3 researchers, working independently, in 3 different decades, in 3 different states, described the identical forging signature using nearly identical technical vocabulary without ever once citing one another's work, for the simple reason that none of them knew the other's findings existed at all. Consider plainly what an 11th century date for hand-forged iron in the western Great Lakes actually asks of the accepted timeline. The region's indigenous metalworking tradition is not in question on its own terms. The old copper complex, well documented across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, shows that peoples of this basin were cold hammering native copper into tools and ornaments as early as 6,000 years before the present, a tradition studied, published, and accepted without controversy for over a century. What that tradition never included, in any site excavated to date, is smelting. Copper in this region was worked cold, straight from naturally occurring metal deposits, never heated in a furnace, never reduced from ore, never folded and forged the way a blacksmith folds and forges iron. The Reeves tool and its two counterparts are not cold-worked native metal. They are smelted, folded, hammer-forged Bloomery iron, a technology that demands a furnace capable of sustained high heat, a source of iron ore, and a maker who already understood the process before ever touching this particular piece of metal. That capability, on the accepted record, simply does not belong here yet, 3 to 4 centuries before European contact introduces it by any documented route. So the 11th century date asks either for an ironworking tradition among the region's indigenous peoples that left behind no other physical trace anywhere in the archaeological record, no smelting slag heaps, no furnace remains, no surviving oral tradition describing the practice, or it asks for contact with an iron-using outside culture centuries earlier and considerably farther inland than any currently accepted model allows for, at a moment when Norse expansion into North America is documented no farther than a single confirmed site on the northern tip of Newfoundland, well over 1,000 miles from a bog in Newaygo County. Neither possibility is a comfortable one for the existing model to absorb. Both possibilities remain, on the physical evidence recovered so far, considerably more defensible than the only remaining alternative, which is that 3 independent radiocarbon dates across 3 separate states, each one tied directly to a hand-forged iron object bearing an identical and highly specific metallurgical signature, are nothing more than coincidence, 3 unconnected errors that happen to agree with one another down to the century. The State Historical Office in Michigan today lists the Reeves find in its archive index as an object of undetermined provenance pending further study. That listing has not changed in the 6 decades since Adrian Voss filed his memorandum and then quietly stepped away from the question entirely. Pending further study is not a conclusion. It is a placeholder, and placeholders do not require anyone to act on them, which may be precisely why the phrase has been allowed to sit attached to this file for 60 years without a single institution ever reopening it. The wood is dated 3 times over in 3 states by 3 separate laboratories working decades apart. The metallurgy is documented and consistent. The tool itself sits today in a case outside Fremont, Michigan, available to anyone who bothers to make the drive and ask to see it, which in 6 decades almost nobody ever has. Walton Reeves, who inherited the object from his father and who is now well into his 80s, still keeps it in the same case his father built for it by hand, set on a shelf in a back room where the light stays low and even through every season of the year. He still shows it to the rare visiting researcher who calls ahead, walking them through the same 2-page memorandum his father kept photocopied alongside the tool itself, the ink long since faded to a pale brown. He still tells the same story his own father told him about the morning the peat finally gave the thing up, the cold mud, the glint that shouldn't have been there, the weight of it in a trapper's palm. He has said, more than once, that he does not need a university's permission to know what he is looking at, because the tool has never once, across 60 years, required anyone's approval to be exactly what it is. It was forged by a hand that understood fire and iron the way any working smith understands them, centuries before the historical record says a hand like that should have existed anywhere near that river, and it survived in the cold, oxygen-starved dark of a Michigan bog long enough for a trapper to pull it back into the daylight on an ordinary October morning, entirely indifferent to whether the record was ready to receive it or not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.